What happens when a single miscalculation in the Caribbean sky is enough to drag the United States, Venezuela, and their global allies into a crisis that could reshape the balance of power in 2025? The question hit Washington, Caracas, and every NATO capital the moment Venezuelan radar identified a U.S. aircraft carrier strike group edging toward waters the Maduro government considers a defensive red line. It was a scene that unfolded with cinematic suddenness, cobalt seas, humid air rising from the Caribbean, and then alarmed scrambled jets, and the unmistakable roar of engines built for war. According to regional defense observers and early Reuters dispatches, it was the closest the hemisphere had come to an aerial confrontation since the Cold War. And in an era where US-China tensions simmer in the Pacific, Israel and Iran trade shadow strikes, and the Ukraine front grinds through its bloodiest winter yet, the world recognized the risk instantly a spark in the Caribbean could cascade across continents. On the horizon, the U.S. carrier group advanced with steady discipline. President Donald Trump's administration had emphasized a message of dominance at sea, framing freedom of navigation operations as a cornerstone of American strength. To the Pentagon, this movement was routine. To Caracas, it was a threat. Venezuelan command centers registered the inbound formation and reacted without hesitation. Orders cut through the static scramble fighters. From El Libertador Air Base, the twin-engine Sukhoi Su-30 Mk2 fighters lifted off afterburners, shattering the Caribbean calm. Beneath their wings hung R-77 long-range missiles and R-73 heat-seeking weapons, Russian-designed tools built for equal-footed dogfights with Western jets. As the Su-30s closed distance, the U.S. carrier group shifted posture. FA-18 Super Hornets were rolled to the catapult, and E-2D Hawkeye extended the fleet's vision beyond the curvature of the sea. Guided missile destroyers widened their protective arcs. Defense News reports this phase as the moment when both sides reached tactical readiness, a level where one wrong radar lock could trigger a chain of irreversible escalation. The choreography of deterrence unfolded over open water, Venezuelan pilots tightened formation, executing intimidation passes deliberately short of provocation standards, while American aircraft maintained altitude discipline to signal strength without aggression. This confrontation, brief yet electrifying, revealed a deeper strategic truth. Venezuela wanted recognition not as Washington's subordinate, but as a sovereign actor capable of contesting the world's strongest navy. Meanwhile, the Trump administration faced a dilemma echoing across global hotspots: how to project power without triggering the very conflict deterrence is meant to prevent. The echoes of Ukraine's drone-dominated front, Israel's high-tempo airstrikes against Iranian proxies, and China's pressure near Taiwan were unmistakable. Each region represents a world where miscalculations multiply, alliances harden, and crises accelerate faster than diplomacy can intervene. As the two formations approached their closest point of potential clash, the question hung in the Caribbean air like static. How far would each side go to defend prestige territory and perception? The answer for now remained uncertain, and the world watched, wondering what crack in the global order might finally give way. The order reached the Venezuelan pilots with a clarity that cut through the tension-maintained heading, close distance, and force identification. What began as a standard radar warning had evolved into a moment where two military doctrines, one shaped by decades of U.S. domination at sea, the other forged through years of Venezuelan attempts to assert sovereignty, were about to collide. The Sukhoi Su-30 Mk2s, each carrying a weapons load capable of damaging even the most sophisticated naval assets, pushed forward with unwavering precision. Their approach was not reckless. It was calculated, a deliberate signal that Venezuela would defend its perceived borders regardless of the asymmetric balance of power. Local Venezuelan outlets amplified this display of resolve, while BBC analysts noted that Caracas had deployed its most capable air asset, a sign of how seriously the government viewed the U.S. carrier's presence. On board the American Strike Group tension-activated protocol, Super Hornets moved to the catapults not yet fueled for launch, but poised a silent message that Washington, and by extension President Trump, was not stepping back. The U.S. Navy operates by rules designed to avoid accidental escalation, yet Reuters highlighted the significance at standoff distances. This narrow intent becomes harder to interpret. A banked turn could be seen as a feint, a radar ping could be mistaken for a lock, a defensive maneuver could resemble an attack. As the formations entered visual proximity, the choreography became almost theatrical. The Venezuelan jets executed a crossing maneuver passing parallel to the carrier group's flight deck at a distance far closer than U.S. commanders preferred. Jane's Defense Weekly examining pilot telemetry later noted that the Su-30s maintained a disciplined non-lock posture, avoiding radar modes that could trigger an American response. But from the bridge of the carrier, this restraint could just as easily have been misread. Every officer knew that in the South China Sea, such maneuvers conducted by Chinese aircraft against US surveillance planes had already led to near collisions. The Caribbean was now experiencing its own version of that high-risk ritual. Strategically, this moment exposed the psychology of asymmetric confrontation. Venezuela's pilots had no illusions about the scale of US power. They also understood the value of perception. A controlled display of aggression can compel even a superpower to recalculate. Meanwhile, Washington faced the same dilemmas it confronts in Eastern Europe and the Middle East: assert dominance too aggressively and risk war, appear hesitant and risk emboldening rivals. The shadow of Ukraine lingered here as well, a reminder of how rapidly contested airspace can devolve into drone strikes and escalating commitments. The Venezuelan aircraft maintaining tight formation continued their trajectory until the US carrier group was forced into a tactical choice: escalate hold position or adjust course. Trump's national security team briefed in real time reinforced standing policy: avoid kinetic confrontation unless hostile action is unequivocal. In the end, the decision aboard the carrier was measured. The fleet shifted a few degrees enough to de-escalate without signaling capitulation. The Venezuelan pilots recorded their final message, a declaration of defense rather than threat. The Americans maintained radio silence. The sky remained tense but unbroken. The world exhaled. What then does it mean when smaller nations confront superpowers confidently and superpowers decide to step back? The confrontation in the Caribbean did not end in missiles or fire, but its strategic implications rippled far beyond the horizon. What unfolded between Venezuelan Su-30 Mk2s and a US carrier group was not merely a moment of brinkmanship. It was a revealing clash of doctrines shaped by history, politics, and global power recalibration. For the United States under President Donald Trump, naval dominance remains a pillar of national identity. Carrier strike groups serve as the ultimate symbol of reach deterrence and alliance assurance. But for Venezuela, a nation under sanctions and increasingly aligned with Russia and Iran, the presence of a US carrier near its defensive perimeter was interpreted as a challenge to its sovereignty and political survival. Reuters later noted that regional analysts viewed the Venezuelan response not as reckless, but as a textbook assertion of territorial red lines by a state seeking recognition in a multipolar system. At its core, the standoff illuminated the competing architectures of power projection. The US relies on a vast network of alliances and bases, while Venezuela leans on Russian-built airframes, asymmetric tactics, and the political narrative of resisting foreign encroachment. According to BBC defense correspondents, Caracas has increasingly adopted a strategy mirroring Iran's, portraying every confrontation as proof that the nation stands firm against Western coercion. In this framing, even a near miss becomes a victory. Meanwhile, the US Navy views these confrontations through a lens refined by decades of Cold War interactions: escalate only when necessary, maintain discipline, and avoid giving adversaries the pretext to claim aggression. But the strategic complexity runs deeper. Defense News and Jane's have both noted that Venezuela's Su-30 Mk2s, though limited in number, represent a real capability. Equipped with long-range R-77 missiles and backed by Russian technicians, they pose a non-trivial challenge to American air assets in a contested zone. The Venezuelan calculus, therefore, was not suicidal. It was a demonstration grounded in the belief that the US, stretched by commitments in Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific, might hesitate to intensify another crisis. This assumption reflects a broader shift in global security dynamics. As conflicts multiply, the threshold for confrontation becomes dangerously ambiguous. The Ukraine war has shown how rapid salvos, drone swarms, and long-range strikes can redefine borders in days. Israel's shadow war with Iran has proven that retaliatory spirals can erupt unpredictably. And in the Pacific, China's unrelenting pressure on Taiwan has forced the US to reconsider how quickly localized crises could escalate into multi-theater conflict. Against this backdrop, even a regional power like Venezuela now understands that strategic space exists space to challenge, test, and probe without immediately triggering an overwhelming American response. Yet the questions facing Washington remain profound. Does stepping back encourage more confrontations, or does restraint reduce the chances of an accidental war? NATO allies, especially European states already navigating the Ukraine front, worry that Washington's every move is now scrutinized by Moscow and Beijing for signs of fatigue or overstretch. The Guardian's diplomacy desk even suggested that the Caribbean incident may become a case study in how medium powers exploit strategic bandwidth to shift regional balances. In the end, the standoff revealed a world where old assumptions falter. Power is no longer measured solely in tonnage or missile count, but in perception, narrative, and timing. The United States remains unmatched militarily, but adversaries increasingly understand something critical. Superpowers avoid unnecessary wars, and hesitation can be leveraged. If smaller states learn to weaponize perception this effectively, what new challenges will the US and its allies face in the next confrontation? The near collision in the Caribbean did not occur in isolation. It echoed like a warning shot across multiple global flashpoints where rival powers test boundaries with increasing frequency. In Eastern Europe, the Ukraine war has evolved into a grinding contest of attrition, with Russian glide bomb strikes and Ukrainian long-range drone attacks reshaping how modern borders are defended. DW analysts argue that the Caribbean incident mirrors a broader global trend. Nations are no longer waiting for great powers to dictate outcomes. They are asserting themselves, probing limits, and using brinkmanship as a strategic tool. Venezuela's maneuvers resembled the assertiveness seen when Ukrainian drone squadrons push into contested airspace, or when Russian jets shadow NATO aircraft dangerously close over the Black Sea. The battlefield logic has migrated worldwide. Perception shapes deterrence, and deterrence shapes survival. Similar parallels emerged in the Middle East. Israel and Iran, locked in a long shadow conflict, routinely test each other through proxy strikes, cyber intrusions, and aerial interceptions. Al Jazeera reported that recent Israeli operations in Syria and Iran's drone deployments revealed a pattern: rapid escalations, followed by sudden retreats once both sides signal they have proven their point. Venezuela's actions fit this rhythm: precisely assert pressure, retreat before the threshold of irreversible conflict is crossed. The world is witnessing a diplomacy of brinkmanship, not dialogue. The Indo-Pacific tells the same story with different actors. China's aggressive air and naval maneuvers around Taiwan and the South China Sea have produced dozens of near misses. American surveillance aircraft have faced Chinese fighters closing within meters, prompting diplomatic protests from Washington. Reuters linked these events to a growing perception that the strategic temperature worldwide is rising, with smaller or regional powers increasingly willing to emulate Beijing's tactics to test American resolve. What happened in the Caribbean was not simply Venezuela reacting emotionally. It was following a script already written thousands of miles away, a script where assertive posturing equals political strength. From a strategic perspective, this convergence is dangerous. Each global flashpoint reinforces the others. Every time a nation pushes a boundary and the US avoids escalation, adversarial states study the restraint. China examines American actions in the Caribbean to infer how the US Navy might respond near Taiwan. Russia watches to gauge Washington's bandwidth for multi-theater tension. Iran interprets these signals when calculating how far to push proxy militias. This interconnectedness means that even localized incidents now have implications for NATO cohesion, US prestige, and Western deterrence architecture. As The Guardian observed, crises no longer exist as isolated events. They form a chain, each link vibrating when another is struck. For Venezuela, the standoff provided domestic validation and international messaging. For the United States, it became another data point in a world where confrontation and caution collide daily. For the global system, it was yet another sign that stability is fraying. Great power rivalry has created an environment in which medium powers and even fragile states are emboldened to act as catalysts of tension. But if these global patterns continue to escalate and intertwine, what happens the next time two adversaries miscalculate and neither side is willing to blink? Beneath the roar of afterburners and the vast metallic silhouettes of warships lies a quieter, more fragile truth. Every geopolitical gamble collapses onto human lives. In Venezuela, families watched state television with a mix of fear and pride as Su-30 Mk2 fighters streaked across the sky. For many, the standoff was not a distant military event. It was a reminder of how quickly external pressure can escalate into national crisis. Years of sanctions, economic turbulence, and political isolation have left Venezuelan society strained, yet moments like this forge a narrative of resilience. BBC World Service reported a surge of public sentiment framing the jet scramble as a defense of dignity, not merely territory. But beneath that pride was anxiety, the kind that rises when a superpower's shadow stretches over domestic uncertainty. Across the Caribbean coast, fishermen paused their work as rumors spread of US jets preparing to launch. Tourism workers wondered whether the unfolding tension would scare off visitors during an already fragile economic season. Venezuelan soldiers stationed along the coastline received hurried updates, knowing that in modern warfare, the line between crisis and catastrophe can collapse in seconds. DW highlighted how civilian infrastructure near military zones often becomes involuntary collateral in geopolitical confrontations. A single misfire could have plunged coastal towns into chaos. For ordinary Venezuelans, sovereignty was not a political slogan, it was a question of survival. On the American side, sailors aboard the carrier group moved through their routines with professional discipline. Many were young, 19, 20, 21 individuals who had never experienced direct confrontation with a hostile aircraft at such proximity. The psychological weight of responsibility pressed onto every decision. A radar operator's misinterpretation, a pilot's momentary lapse in judgment, or a commander's delayed order could ignite a conflict capable of reshaping hemispheric security. According to Reuters interviews with former US Navy officers, the mental strain of these standoffs is profound. You know you're seconds away from a decision that could define history, and you also know no one back home sees that weight. Beyond the military, US families with deployed relatives tracked updates silently refreshing news feeds, hoping that silence meant de-escalation rather than suppressed tragedy. The American public, already stretched by global commitments in Europe and the Middle East, viewed the Caribbean incident with a blend of fatigue and caution. Would another front open? Could Washington sustain yet another geopolitical confrontation without overstretching its forces? These questions echoed across living rooms, policy circles, and alliances alike. Meanwhile, humanitarian observers warned of cascading risks. Should conflict erupt, regional migration flows already pressured by Venezuela's economic crisis could spike. Oil markets sensitive to any Caribbean instability could jolt global prices, affecting everything from transport to food distribution. And for Venezuela's neighbors, particularly Colombia and Brazil, a conflict at sea could rapidly spill into border tensions, illegal crossings, and strained diplomatic channels. The Guardian's regional analyst pointed out that the human consequences of a miscalculated air encounter are rarely felt by the decision makers, they are felt by those with the least power. In moments like this, the global system forces a difficult question to the surface. When nations defend prestige and power, who protects the lives caught beneath their ambitions? The Caribbean standoff ended without a shot fired, yet its consequences continued reverberating through diplomatic cables, intelligence assessments, and military briefings across the world. The US carrier's slight course adjustment, a maneuver measured in degrees, not miles, was interpreted differently depending on the vantage point. In Washington, it was portrayed as disciplined de-escalation, a decision rooted in President Donald Trump's directive to avoid unnecessary foreign entanglements while maintaining American dominance. In Caracas, however, state media framed it as a triumph, a moment when Venezuelan Su-30 Mk2 fighters compelled the world's most powerful navy to reconsider its approach. Analysts from Reuters and BBC noted that this narrative, while simplified, resonated deeply in a multipolar world where perception increasingly shapes geopolitical reality. But the deeper story is far more complex. The standoff exemplified the new security environment of 2025, one defined not by large-scale wars, but by confrontations at the edge of catastrophe. The boundaries are thin, the reactions fast, and the consequences global. The United States, already navigating rising tensions with China in the Pacific, coordinating NATO support for Ukraine's counteroffensive, and monitoring Israel-Iran escalations, must balance projection of strength with strategic restraint. A single misstep in the Caribbean could have signaled vulnerability to Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. Conversely, a forceful response could have ignited a regional conflict that would drain resources and fracture alliances. For Venezuela, the incident was a calculated gamble, an attempt to prove that even a mid-tier power can confront a superpower if timing, narrative, and political conditions align. Jane's Defense Weekly emphasized that Caracas sought more than territorial defense. It sought legitimacy. By challenging a US carrier group and surviving the encounter unscathed, Venezuela demonstrated a template other states might emulate: assert boundaries, escalate, symbolically retreat before confrontation becomes fatal. This model, already visible in the South China China Sea and Eastern Europe is rapidly becoming a defining feature of 21st century power politics. The strategic danger emerges when too many nations adopt this playbook at once. DW and The Guardian warn that global crises are becoming synchronized, feeding off each other like interconnected fault lines. A flare-up in one region emboldens another elsewhere. An American hesitation in the Caribbean may influence China's calculus around Taiwan. A Venezuelan display of defiance may shape Iranian strategies in the Persian Gulf. A U.S. effort to avoid confrontation may encourage Russia to test the limits along NATO's eastern borders. The world is no longer divided into isolated theaters. It is a single interconnected system where perception of power becomes as consequential as power itself. Which leads to the final unsettling truth revealed by the Caribbean incident: stability now depends less on weapons and more on the interpretation surrounding them. A radar ping, a sharp turn, a radio delay, any of these can trigger a misreading that spirals into disaster. In such an environment, the US and its allies face a daunting task: preserve global deterrence without provoking the very conflicts deterrence seeks to prevent. As the world watches these rising tensions, one question lingers over every conflict zone, from the Donbass to the Red Sea, from the Caribbean to the Taiwan Strait. How many more close calls can the global order survive before one of them goes too far? The 2025 Caribbean standoff between Venezuelan Su-30 Mk2 fighters and a U.S. aircraft carrier group became a symbolic test of modern geopolitical fault lines. The confrontation triggered when the American fleet edged near waters Caracas considered sensitive reflected the rising global trend of brinkmanship in an increasingly multipolar world. Venezuela's scramble of advanced Russian-made fighters showcased a calculated show of strength, leveraging asymmetric capabilities to challenge a superpower without crossing into open conflict. The United States, navigating simultaneous tensions with China, Russia, and Iran, chose measured restraint to avoid sparking a regional war with global consequences. This incident mirrored escalating patterns in Ukraine's drone-driven warfare, Israel-Iran proxy strikes, and US-China aerial intercepts, underscoring how nations now test each other's thresholds through controlled escalation. Behind the military maneuvers lay profound human consequences, from anxious Venezuelan civilians to US sailors facing historic pressure. Ultimately, the standoff revealed a fragile international system in which perception and narrative influence strategic decisions as much as missiles and ships. The world is left to grapple with a critical question if such close calls continue to multiply. Which confrontation will be the one that spirals beyond control?